Hey guys, this is Carrie, and in this video we're going to be making a version of this project where we're looking at like having, I don't know, like over thousands of squares that have the same control, so that when our mouse goes over them, they have a cool visual effect. All right, so let's get started programming this from scratch. So we're going to create a new REPL. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I guess my original name for this project, I had a friend when I first started teaching, he would always play that song All of the Lights every morning from his room really loud. And so I think of this project as the All of the Lights project because it's just a whole bunch of lights that get manipulated when our mouse goes over them. All right, so it's creating our new project, hopefully. Awesome. And I'm going to zoom out here. Oops, no, I'm not going to zoom out here. I'm just going to zoom out here so we can see kind of the overall shape here. It looks like it's a big square with lots of smaller squares inside. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start programming the HTML, which is the content on the web page. And we're going to build that big square that groups all of them together. That's going to be a div with a class of content. So we press tab, and now we've got our big box that's going to contain all of the smaller boxes. So to make use of all of the, or to create all the smaller boxes, we can make use of one of those small cheat codes in REPL, where we could say create a whole bunch of divs. So I'm going to do div.square. So I'm going to create a whole bunch of divs with a class .square. And if I think about the dimensions, I might want to create, I don't know, a 50 by 50 set of squares, which would be 50 times 50, 2,500. Or maybe 30 by 30, that would be like 30 times 30 is 900. I'll go with 30 by 30. So 30 by 30 would be, I want to create 900 of these. Oops. And I saw that this is like the quick creator. When this little thing disappears, it won't do it. So you type all that in and you press tab. And now you have 900 squares. So it's going to look a little different from this one. And that's actually going to be all of our HTML. It's a big div with 900 squares. So if we load it up, it should look completely blank, which it does now. So I'm going to go to, not the JavaScript actually, but the CSS, and we're going to take our two different divs and we're going to style them. So we have the squares, which are the things of class square, and we've got the content, which is the thing of class content. So the content is that big square that's set up into rows and columns. And if you remember from before break, we called that a grid. So we're going to take the content, which is the large box, and we're going to display that as a grid. We're going to do GTC, grid template columns, press tab, and grid template rows. And this way we can set up our columns and rows. And also I'm going to set up a grid gap. So now that I've got everything ready to plug in the numbers, I'm going to leave the repeat thing here because I don't want to type out 30 columns and 30 rows by putting 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 10 pixels like last time. So what we can do instead is we can say repeat 30 times, and each column will be 50 pixels wide. So that would be the same thing as having like 50 pixels, 50 pixels, 50 pixels 30 times, but I don't want to type all of that out. So we'll make use of the code to shorthand things. And also we're going to have 30 rows, and I'm going to make my rows the same size, 50 pixels as well. And then the grid gap will be, okay, so now our cells are, we've got columns that are 50 pixels wide, rows that are 50 pixels wide, our grid gap, let's make it, I don't know, something like 10 pixels. So there'll be a 10 pixel space in between the columns and the rows. And for the squares, let's make them so that their width is 50 pixels, height is 50 pixels. That way each square takes up all of the grid space and also has, let's see, I don't know, a background color. And this is where one of the places where we can get creative here is like a background color of something like, I don't know, I made it green on my last one. I'm just going to stick with green, and then I'm going to defer to you guys to be more creative. So if we refresh this, we'll have, let me zoom, oh, this is 100%. So we have a grid like that. It looks like it's maybe a little big. So what you can do is you can play around with the numbers. So maybe instead of 50 pixels by 50 pixels, something interesting that you could do is if you wanted them to be rectangles instead of squares, you can make it so that the width, which is the dimension in this direction, is 25 pixels, and then change the column to 25 pixels. And now it's going to be weird long rectangles like that. Of course, you can make the height 25 pixels as well to make it go back to a square. So now it's 25 by 25, 25 by 25 for the dimensions. And I'm going to try to throw a, let's see, margin auto on the content to center the content. I didn't center it properly. Let's see. Let's do, for this, the width of this is approximately 25 times, it's about 30 times 30. So let me just see. Let me make the width of this 1,000 pixels. And now centering it, it puts it in the center. 1,000 wasn't quite right. I wonder if with auto works. Nope, with auto doesn't work. Okay, the centering is a little bit tough here. I guess I can cheat my way around it by doing, let's see, body, and then text align center. And I'm going to make this not a grid, but an inline grid. And I think this should do it. There we go. Now it's actually in the exact center. All right, cool. So now we're ready to do the JavaScript. And so the way that the JavaScript is going to work is we're going to take each of these squares, and when our mouse goes over it, or our mouse enters into the div, it's going to do something to the div that it goes over. And what it's going to do is it's going to restyle it by adding a second class into the HTML. So it's not just square, but it will be something like active, because it's now moving. So I'm going to define a active class here, even though nothing has the active class. And we can start off with a background of a different color, red. And then we'll start to add some more complicated things as we program it. So now that we've got this active class, we're ready to do the JavaScript. So our JavaScript is going to make use of these tools that we talked about before break, which is let's select everything on the page and then code it in very few lines. So to select all of these things on the page, we're going to do let squares equal document.querySelector. And instead of selecting one square, which document.querySelector would do, we're going to select all of the things that match class.square. Then what we're going to do is we're going to program all the squares at the same time by doing squares.forEach. And this is that thing with the parentheses, so please keep track of this as you code it. We're going to go into the squares list, and we're going to take each square, and then we draw an arrow, and then we do the curly parentheses. And the idea here is that this squares variable selects all of the squares, which is 900 items on our page. And then by doing squares.forEach square, it will go through and apply the same code for each of the 900 square items. So what we want to do is we want to take each of the squares, which are now called square, and we want to add an event listener to them. And the event that we're going to listen to is a new one this time. It's going to be mouse enter, I believe. So square dot add event listener, mouse enter. And then we're going to run a function, which is after our mouse enters, we're going to make it so that the square, the class list of the square, we add to that the active property, or the active class. So what we're going to do is we're saying take all the squares, and for each of them, add an event listener to it, so that when the mouse enters it, it runs this function, which is to give it the class of active. So now you can see that as the mouse enters these, it allows us to draw on our screen, which is pretty cool. But we can make a couple of changes that will make this maybe more interesting. What we could do is we could have a more interesting visual effect, which is instead of just coloring it red, we could define the active class to be a little more complicated by applying some of our transformation properties. So we'll do a transform and then maybe something like rotate. And when we rotate, we need to put an angle inside of the parentheses. So 2 full circles, 720 degrees. When we use the transform properties, it's really useful to, instead of having it go immediately from the square state to the active state, to apply a transition time to the square so that it will take 1 second to complete the full rotation of 720 degrees. Let's see how that looks. So this is pretty cool. And then they stay in that fully rotated red space. Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Let's see. We can add some more complicated transforms. So if you type in transform CSS, W3 Schools will give you a list of possible transformations that you could do. So let's see. We could try, I don't know. I've never done like scale Y or skew Y. I've never done skew Y. Let's try that. So to add more than one transformation, we go transform rotate, skew Y, and then down here it will tell me the property values that it needs. So skew Y needs an angle. So I'm going to put something like 30 degrees just to try it out. Let's see what that looks like. Ooh, cool. So it turns our squares into like a parallelogram or rhombus. I can't tell which one that is. Pretty cool. Okay, it's like stretches them out. And then another one that's fun here is the translate property. So you'll notice that these are all the properties from geometry class that you learned like 4 years ago as a freshman. So translate is going to be a translation in the X and Y direction. So we can go, I don't know, 100 pixels to the right. And then weirdly, down in coding is positive in the Y-axis. So we'll translate 100 pixels and then 300 pixels. And let's see how that looks. Oh wow, that's pretty wild. So they fly right out of there and move pretty dramatically. I don't know if you like that. It's pretty cool though. One thing that's interesting is that they never go back to their original place. So once you like move around a lot, you have these white spaces, and you might like that. You're welcome to leave it like this. But if you want to have them reset back, what you can do is the thing that's causing this to be here, instead of in its spot, like here, or wherever it should be, I guess here, this one, is that it still has the class of active. So if we were to delete the class of active, it would delete these styles, and then it would go back to being just a square in its normal spot. So to do that, what we can do is we can go into the JavaScript, and we can say after we make the class active, we don't want to immediately remove that active class. What we want to do is we want to create a timeout. So we'll do set timeout, and this will create a pause. It's very similar to set interval, where we're going to run a function. But instead of running that function repeatedly, we want to run that function once after a pause of 1 second. This is 1,000 milliseconds, or after 2 seconds. And what we want to do after 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds, is I want to take the square. I want to go into the class list, and I want to remove the active class. And that way it will be no longer active. And so after 1 second, it will delete these styles, and it will go back to having just the square styles. So let's see how this looks. So now you can see the transform is the translate is pretty dramatic. So I'm gonna reduce that to a less dramatic transform, 10 and 30. I'm also gonna delete the skew Y because I think it's a little hard to see everything that's going on here. So let me refresh this. And now you can see that they move a little bit out of their space, but they eventually go back to their space. And hopefully you guys can be pretty creative with this and find a way to, I don't know, use different transformations. There's a whole bunch of them here. I don't know what all of them do. You could also find a way to change the original setups, that maybe instead of being squares with 25 and 25 and columns that are 25 and 25, maybe they start off as rectangles. Yeah, I think you can use different colors, obviously. You can change the sizes so that you have really big squares that are doing these things. I think there's a lot of room to be creative with this one, and hopefully it didn't take too long to program it, but I think it's really cool, and we see a lot of new features mixed in with some old ones. So one new feature is now whenever our mouse enters the square, it applies these styles instead of clicking. And then also we saw the usages of the for each loop to immediately control in only 10 lines of code 900 objects on our webpage. 900 squares. All right, guys, I hope you found this video cool. See you in class tomorrow.